The Journey of the Hartley Family, an Oregon Trail Story. A relaxing educational tale. Take a deep breath and settle in. This is the story of the Hartley family, Samuel and Margaret, their 3 children Emma, Thomas, and little James, and how they traveled 2,000 miles from Missouri to Oregon's Willamette Valley in the spring of 1852. On April 15, 1852, the Hartley wagon joined 37 others departing from Independence, Missouri. Their wagon carried 2,500 pounds carefully packed, 200 pounds of flour, 150 pounds of bacon, 10 pounds of coffee, 20 pounds of sugar, and dried beans. Tied to the back walked Buttercup, their milk cow, who would provide fresh milk and butter throughout the journey. Margaret had packed things that weren't practical but mattered deeply: her mother's quilt, the family Bible with birth dates inscribed inside, and small packets of seeds from her garden back home. Apple seeds. Tomato seeds. Her grandmother's rose cuttings wrapped in damp cloth. These seeds were acts of faith, promises to a future she couldn't yet see. Samuel had sold their farm for enough to buy the wagon, 2 teams of oxen, and supplies. The oxen, Ben, Duke, Chester, and Sam, were slower than horses but steadier. Samuel had already learned their personalities during the weeks of preparation. Ben was stubborn but strong. Duke was gentle and reliable. The rifle shot came at 4 a.m. on their 3rd morning. Emma, 12 years old, was already learning to wake in darkness. She helped her mother start the fire using dried buffalo chips they'd collected the evening before. The chips burned surprisingly clean, with little smell. While coffee boiled in the iron pot, Margaret mixed flour and water for quick bread. Samuel and 10-year-old Thomas packed the wagon with practiced movements, bedrolls tied down, dishes secured in their wooden crates, the water barrel checked for leaks. By the time the eastern sky turned from black to deep blue to pink, breakfast was eaten. Bacon, bread, coffee. The same meal they'd eaten yesterday and would eat tomorrow. Already the routine was becoming automatic. At 7 a.m., the wagons began rolling. The Hartley family walked alongside their wagon, everyone except little James, who was only 4 and rode inside when he tired. The pace was slow, about 2 miles per hour, the speed of oxen. Samuel walked near the team, occasionally calling commands. Margaret and Emma walked together, their long skirts collecting dust. Thomas ranged ahead, then circled back, his boy's energy not yet worn down by the trail's monotony. The landscape in those first weeks was green and rolling, the tallgrass prairie stretched endlessly. Thomas collected wildflowers for his mother. The wagon train moved like a long serpent, 38 wagons stretched over half a mile. They'd elected a captain, a man named Jacob Morrison who'd made the journey once before. He'd established rules: each family took turns being first in line to avoid the worst dust. Faster wagons could only pass on the left, and only with permission. There were designated areas for cooking fires when they camped at night. By their 2nd week, Emma had taken on the job of collecting buffalo chips for fuel. She made a game of it, seeing how many she could gather in the 2 hours before sunset. Thomas herded their milk cow and the 3 extra cattle they'd brought. Even James had a job, watching the younger children from the Stevens wagon while the adults set up camp. At noon each day, the wagon train stopped. This was the hottest part of the day, and the animals needed rest and grazing time. The Hartley children attended makeshift school under the wagon during these stops. Mrs. Peterson, a former teacher from Ohio, taught reading and arithmetic. They practiced penmanship in the dirt with sticks. Emma was keeping a journal of the journey, carefully recording each day's events in her careful script. On Sundays, they didn't travel. It was a day of complete rest that everyone desperately needed. The Hartleys observed these Sabbaths gratefully. Margaret did laundry at whatever river or creek they'd camped near, joining the other women at the water's edge. They scrubbed clothes against rocks with lye soap Margaret made from bacon grease and ashes. The women talked and laughed while they worked, about children, about the journey, about the lives they'd left and the ones they hoped to build. Samuel used Sundays to grease the wagon wheels and check the oxen's hooves. The men gathered too, sharing information about the trail ahead, discussing whether to take the northern or southern route at the upcoming fork. In the afternoon, the entire wagon train gathered for church service. They sang hymns without accompaniment at first, until Mr. Chun pulled out his fiddle. After that, Sundays had music. Oh, Susanna was everyone's favorite, but they sang hymns too. The music wasn't just entertainment, it was medicine for homesickness. By their fourth week, they'd reached the true Great Plains. The grass stretched to the horizon in every direction, swaying in waves with the wind. It felt like crossing an ocean, the same vast emptiness, the same distant horizons that never seemed closer. The wildlife astonished them. Buffalo herds passed near the trail, dark masses that stretched as far as they could see. Samuel counted for an hour once as a herd crossed their path, and they were still coming. Antelope bounded alongside the wagons, curious and beautiful. Prairie dogs created vast underground cities, their high-pitched barks filling the air. Thomas desperately wanted to hunt buffalo, but Samuel explained they had no way to preserve that much meat. Instead, Samuel occasionally shot antelope or rabbits, varying their diet from the constant bacon and beans. The nights were different here. Without trees or buildings or any light except their campfires, the darkness was complete. But the stars were overwhelming. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light. Margaret had grown up in Pennsylvania, in a town where stars were faint points above buildings. Here, lying on her bedroll and looking up, she felt she could fall into that infinite depth. Samuel taught the children constellations from a worn guidebook. The Big Dipper pointing to Polaris. Orion with his belt. These weren't just beautiful, they were navigation tools, confirming they were still heading west. In their 6th week, they reached the Platte River, a mile wide and an inch deep, the other travelers joked. The wagon train followed it for weeks. Water was everywhere, but not always safe to drink. Margaret had learned to assess water quality. Clear, fast-moving streams were safest. She kept vinegar to purify questionable water. The food had grown monotonous. Breakfast, bacon, bread, coffee. Cold leftovers for lunch during the noon rest. Dinner, beans, bacon, bread, coffee. Occasionally Margaret made dried apple pie, reconstituting the leathery apple slices with water and molasses. The coffee was more important than food. Samuel joked that he could survive on coffee alone. Emma's shoes had worn through. Margaret patched them, then patched the patches. Eventually Emma started walking in moccasins that Mrs. Whitehorse, a native woman operating a ferry crossing, had traded for some of Margaret's bread. Mrs. Whitehorse and her family ran a ferry across a particularly deep section of the Platte. She spoke some English and shared information about the trail ahead. Her kindness contradicted everything the Hartleys had been told about hostile Indians before leaving Missouri. In fact, their interactions with native tribes had all been peaceful. At one point, a Pawnee man guided them to a better water source when their usual camping spot had dried up. At trading posts, native traders offered fresh vegetables grown in small gardens at river crossings. The feared attacks they'd heard about in Independence never materialized. Margaret's clothing had adapted too. She'd abandoned one of her petticoats in the second week. It was simply too hot and cumbersome. By the 6th week, she'd quietly removed her corset, something she'd worn every day since age 14. The freedom of movement was startling. Her dress was patched and faded, nothing like the carefully maintained wardrobe she'd kept in Missouri. Fashion had given way to function, and she found she didn't miss it. The wagon train had become family. Samuel's closest friend was now Ernst Müller, a German immigrant whose thick accent had initially been hard to understand. But Ernst was a skilled blacksmith, and he'd repaired Samuel's wagon axle when it cracked crossing a rocky stretch. Samuel had helped Ernst's wife when she fell ill, sitting up through the night to spell Ernst at her bedside. Margaret had grown especially close to Sarah Chun, the wife of the fiddler. Sarah had helped Margaret when Emma developed a high fever in the 7th week. Sarah made willow bark tea. She said the bark contained something that reduced fever and pain. She was right. Emma recovered within 2 days. When Sarah's baby was born in their 8th week on the trail, Margaret served as midwife along with 2 other women. The baby, a healthy girl, was named Hope. The entire wagon train celebrated with an extra ration of coffee and a bonfire with music. Mr. Chun played his fiddle, while couples danced simple reels on the prairie grass under the stars. Young people were courting too. Emma had caught Thomas teasing her about William Peterson, a 16-year-old boy from 3 wagons back who'd been finding excuses to walk near the Hartley wagon. Margaret smiled at this. She and Samuel had met on a church picnic when she was Emma's age. Romance didn't stop because you were crossing a continent. The children ranged between wagons during the day, a mixed age group playing games and helping each other. James's best friend was now a 5-year-old named Lucy whose family was from Virginia. The children had created their own society, unconcerned with where families were from or what their accents sounded like. This mixing of people from different states and backgrounds was creating something new. Southerners and Northerners traveled side by side. The tensions that would soon erupt into civil war seemed distant here. Germans, Irish, and Americans whose families had been here for generations learned each other's songs and recipes. What mattered on the trail wasn't your pedigree but whether you helped your neighbors and pulled your weight. In their 10th week, they reached Courthouse Rock, a massive formation rising from the plains. They'd seen it on the horizon for 3 days before reaching it, growing larger each day. When they finally passed it, the children ran around its base, shouting to hear their echoes. 2 days later came Chimney Rock, even more dramatic, a towering spire that looked like a finger pointing at heaven. Thomas begged to climb it, but Samuel explained they couldn't spare the time. They took an hour to rest there, staring up at this wonder of erosion and time. The landmarks were psychological milestones. They proved the journey was real, that they were making progress. Each one could be written about in letters home, something specific to report beyond "we're still walking." At Independence Rock, a massive granite dome, the entire wagon train stopped for an afternoon. Thousands of travelers had carved their names into the soft rock. The Hartleys climbed up and found a smooth spot. Samuel carved carefully, Hartley family, Missouri to Oregon, June 1852. Their names joined thousands of others, a pioneer guest book that would outlast all of them. They also saw the detritus of earlier wagon trains. The trail was littered with abandoned items, furniture too heavy to keep carrying, trunks of clothing, even an entire piano sitting weathered by the side of the trail. Early travelers, overloaded with supplies, had shed them as animals tired. Later travelers, like the Hartleys, collected useful items. Thomas found a perfectly good axe handle someone had discarded. There was an economy to this. At Fort Laramie, their first major resupply point in their 11th week, prices were shocking. A letter home cost 25 cents to mail, a fortune. But people paid it. Margaret wrote to her sister in Pennsylvania, a long letter describing everything they'd seen, knowing it would take months to arrive. At the fort, they encountered their first unofficial post office. At a prominent rock formation, earlier travelers had left letters tucked into crevices, addressed to family members they knew were coming behind. An eastbound traveler agreed to carry the Hartleys' letters back to Missouri for posting. Samuel left a note for his brother, who was planning to make the journey next year. Water is scarce between Fort Kearny and Laramie. Bring extra barrels. After Fort Laramie, the landscape changed. The endless flatness gave way to high plains, where the air grew thin and clear. Breathing became slightly harder. The children tired more easily. They were also getting genuinely tired. 10 weeks of walking, of sleeping on hard ground, of the same monotonous food, of constant dust and sun, it wore on everyone. Margaret's feet had blisters on top of blisters. Samuel's face was burned dark brown, his hands cracked and calloused. Emma moved with the automatic efficiency of exhaustion. Sleep was precious, but often interrupted. They slept under the wagon on thin mattresses stuffed with straw. Families took turns on night watch, guarding against stampedes. Summer thunderstorms on the plains were spectacular and terrifying, lightning that seemed to touch earth and sky simultaneously, thunder that shook the ground. These storms woke everyone, sending them scrambling to protect supplies from rain. After one particularly bad storm, everything was damp. They spent a miserable day walking in wet clothes, and that night Samuel and Thomas both developed coughs. Margaret made them willow bark tea and kept them as warm as possible. The coughs lasted a week, but thankfully didn't develop into anything worse. Without doctors for hundreds of miles, every illness was frightening. Personal hygiene had become creative and rare. A full bath was a luxury, maybe once a week if they camped near good water. Most days they washed face and hands in a basin, using water sparingly. Margaret's hair, which she'd once washed twice a week, was now washed maybe once every 2 weeks. She wore her bonnet constantly, partly to keep it clean. Thomas and James had stopped complaining about baths. They'd adapted to being dirty most of the time. Everyone on the trail was equally dusty, equally weathered. Social norms had adjusted to reality. In their 14th week, they saw mountains on the western horizon. The Rocky Mountains, blue and distant and magnificent. After weeks of relatively flat terrain, those peaks were thrilling. They were also daunting. Those mountains had to be crossed. South Pass, the famous crossing of the Continental Divide, was anticlimactic in its gentleness. The slope was so gradual that Emma asked when they'd start climbing. Samuel laughed and told her they were already crossing. This wide, gentle valley was the pass. They'd crossed the spine of the continent without even realizing it. But there was real meaning in that crossing. They were now on the western side of the divide. The rivers now flowed toward the Pacific, not the Atlantic. They were closer to Oregon than to Missouri. The wagon train celebrated that night. Mr. Chun played his fiddle, and people danced. Someone had traded for whiskey at the last fort, and the men passed a bottle. Margaret allowed herself one small sip. It burned her throat and made her eyes water, but it felt festive. After South Pass came harder terrain. The trail grew rocky, harder on the wagons and the animals. Duke, one of their steadiest oxen, developed a limp. Samuel examined his hoof and found a stone bruise. They had to slow their pace for a few days to let him recover. They also had to ford rivers, real rivers, not the shallow Platte. The Snake River crossing was terrifying. The wagons had to be partially floated across on makeshift rafts while the oxen swam. Margaret held James tightly, certain they'd all drown. But the men who'd done this before knew what they were doing, and the Hartley wagon made it across safely, though everything inside was damp. By their 18th week, everyone was exhausted. The trail had become brutal, long days of climbing and descending, rocky terrain that broke wagon wheels and wore out animals. They'd been traveling for 4.5 months. The food was the same every day. The children were thinner, quieter. Even Thomas's boundless energy had flagged. But the landscape kept changing, keeping things interesting in spite of exhaustion. They'd left the high plains and entered forested mountains. The Blue Mountains were steep and challenging, but the trees were a welcome change after months of prairie. The air smelled different, pine and mountain dampness instead of dust and grass. In these final weeks, the wagon itself had become truly home. The Hartleys knew every squeak of its wheels, every weak board. They'd organized their supplies with the precision of a ship's cargo. Emma had claimed a corner where she kept her journal and her few treasures. The wagon's canvas bonnet provided the only privacy for changing clothes. Margaret had decorated their wagon interior slightly. She'd hung a small painted plate from home on one of the wooden ribs. It was silly, impractical, but it made the space feel less temporary. In their 20th week, in late August 1852, the wagon train descended into the Willamette Valley. The valley was green and lush, with rivers running clear and cold. After 5 months of dust and heat and endless horizons, this verdant valley looked like paradise. The wagon train dissolved as families claimed land in different areas. The goodbyes were tearful. Sarah Chun promised to write, though they'd be settling 50 miles apart. Ernst Mueller helped Samuel fix his wagon one last time before heading to his own claim. Emma cried when William Peterson's family left. She might never see him again. Samuel claimed 160 acres of good farmland near a river. For the first time in 5 months, they stopped moving. They lived in the wagon for another month while Samuel and Thomas built a cabin. Margaret finally unpacked the good dishes that had traveled 2,000 miles wrapped in quilts. In September, Margaret planted her seeds. The apple seeds and rose cuttings from Missouri went into Oregon soil. They were acts of faith fulfilled. These plants would grow here, would bear fruit and flowers, would put down roots that the Hartley family would tend for generations. Emma continued her journal. "We arrived," she wrote in her careful hand. "The journey is over. Or maybe it's just beginning." The Hartley family was just one of nearly 400,000 people who made this journey between 1840 and 1870. Their story was both unique and universal, unique in its details, universal in its themes of endurance, adaptation, and hope. They'd learned patience from weather, humility from landscape, community from necessity. The 5 months of walking taught them that the journey itself mattered as much as the destination, that how you traveled shaped who you became. The wagon that had been their home for 5 months was eventually dismantled. Samuel used its boards to build a shed. But the Hartley children never forgot it, that small wooden home on wheels that had carried them across a continent. Years later, when Emma was an old woman, she would tell her grandchildren about the journey. About stars so bright you could read by them. About buffalo herds that took hours to pass. About the music of a fiddle on the prairie and the taste of her mother's dried apple pie. About the day they carved their name into Independence Rock, joining thousands of other families in that great migration west. The Oregon Trail may be history now, but its lessons endure, that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things through persistence, preparation, and community. That great journeys happen one small step at a time. That home isn't just a place, sometimes it's the people you travel with and the hope you carry forward.